So there's an interesting distinction because we have, as we mentioned, these two different domains, and generally speaking, people assume that most of the cheating is done online, and maybe people overestimate the amount of cheating that's online. But is it also possible that we both overestimate online cheating but underestimate over-the-board cheating because we assume there's nothing nefarious going on when we can actually see our opponent?
Yeah, it's entirely possible. Yeah, and that's something that I can't test. So this is, just my subjective opinion. But I also think that OTB cheating is kind of a potentially bigger problem, not in terms of the numbers, but in terms of the severity, basically. Yeah. And for that reason, because I know that chess.com's got this, they're really smart guys working as a team, but they don't look at OTB cheating really at all. The only time I think they did was the Neiman case. That was the only time. So I feel like it's something that deserves a little bit more attention, and also that the behavioral type of intervention, like how can we sort of encourage kids to not go down that sort of slope? That's something I'm working on a bit with chess.com. I think that's it's maybe not a big piece of the puzzle, but it's a little bit like COVID, for example. You've got all these different types of angles, and you're never going to get rid of it, but you have to sort of learn to minimize it. And if there are bigger sort of events, like you put in harsher measures, but you also need some sort of societal change as well. So that's basically where I'm coming from.
In your paper, you also talk about the factors affecting suspicion. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So the main one by far is just your own play. That was really sort of the main thing from that, and also the absence of your own blunders. Yeah. And like Fabi said, there are potential reasons for that are rational. There are also hypotheses that it's not rational. It's you sort of trying to externalize the blame, and I think that's something I'd like to explore in future. Trying to really, because I didn't expect to find this at all. And now that I have found it, trying to work out the mechanism is the next step. So I would try to design some sort of experiment where we can see whether or not it really is people externalizing their own faults. And if so, I think that's kind of a powerful finding to spread as part of this behavioral message. Like if you're really suspicious, you may be right. In Fabi's case, we might just have a good feel for it, but just be aware that there is this bias that we've found. Check it if you can. Yeah.
Do you think that people with that bias would be receptive to, like, if you presented evidence that they are biased in that way? Do you think they would be receptive to it?
So not everyone. I think there are some who will always believe that their intuition tops everything and will always sort of discount this sort of research. But I think that's a minority. I think in general, same with cheating, I think there are some people who always cheat, but the vast majority are kind of like swing voters, swing voters in cheating, swing voters in terms of evidence. So I think with evidence, they can change their minds.
Yeah, there's like a lot of, I think, uncertainty with it all. From my discussions with people, it's like very much, I think this, but maybe not. They might change their mind if they see some other evidence.
Yeah.
Actually, I want to ask, because you're kind of tackling these topics that are quite controversial, like you mentioned masks and gender, things related to gender in general, and cheating, of course. Is there a time where you're looking at it from a mathematical perspective, but it's very difficult to break through either like ideological bias or just general bias that people have?
To break through my bias as a researcher?
To break through other people's bias. Like you present evidence, but it's very difficult to convince people with the evidence that you have.
So this is a challenge I face in all of my work, and so my major research project is not at all about chess. It's female genital mutilation or female genital cutting. I don't know if you know this sort of tradition that goes on.
In India, right?
Sorry?
In India?
Mainly in Africa, actually. Parts of Africa. Yeah. And it's related to other things to do with child marriage and a few other things like this. So that's actually my main project. Super tough, super dark sort of project to work on day in, day out, which I try to approach from a mathematical evidence-based thing. And we actually, we ran a big program in Somalia, which had very positive effects. So about 40% of the girls who received our program were never mutilated. So, huge effect, huge improvement in lives. But getting that rolled out across the country was incredibly difficult because there's always going to be people in positions of power who say, yeah, okay, you've got this data, but it's our tradition, or it's our way, or it's, and I'm some white guy from Australia coming into something that's ostensibly an African women's issue, so it's very hard for me to have any sort of clout there. So that for me is a bigger challenge. In the chess world, I find that people are actually pretty receptive to data. Like, you're receptive to it, FIDE's receptive to it, chess.com's receptive to it. There are going to be isolated individuals, some of whom have very large voices on social media or otherwise, who may not be. But I think for the most part, people are willing to take this on board, and people in positions of power or influence, like chess.com, are willing to take it on board. So I think in a way, my chess research is a little bit easier to get across the line.
I feel it's because it's also something somewhat new, and we only recently more or less started discussing it quite at length, right?
Cheating.
Especially, yes,
Yeah,
cheating.
yeah.
Especially since like 2020, with online chess,
Yeah,
I feel like
yeah.
it was an explosion more or less. And now, as you were just mentioning, I think OTB cheating is starting to make its way into the discussion more or less. And you see, some top players, let's say, accusing or being suspicious of players, and now you have the cheating cases that are happening. So yeah, it's an evolving, let's say, subject.
I also think that chess players are wired a little bit differently, even from the average member of the public, because if you were brought up thinking that some line of the Nardov was playable for 20 years, and then new people come along with neural networks and just refute it, you're not going to say, oh yeah, I don't believe it, right? This has always been our way, because you're just going to lose, right? So we're kind of wired that when new evidence, exactly, and when evidence comes, we change our minds. And I think that there is some sort of flow over of that philosophical makeup into other domains as well. For most chess players, I would say.
Yeah, I've met some stubborn chess players. But like, usually people eventually, we're talking about openings, trying to convince that your idea is correct, and we do. Okay, now with engines it's a bit easier. You can't really argue with the engine, but definitely there was a lot of back and forth during earlier analysis times. And yeah, usually people can really stick to their ideas very closely. But yeah, there is that flexibility. Like, eventually, if you are convincing enough, if you have a compelling argument, then chess players do sometimes amend their views.
I think so. I think the new generation in particular, the younger generation, with gender it's a little bit trickier, because like I said, most of the voices, particularly women's voices, it's impossible to detach yourself from your own lived experience. So they're always going to think, whenever they're told, what do you think about this new policy? It's very natural to say, well, would that have worked for me? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we all do. But I don't think it's enough evidence to make something, make a new policy that's going to affect hundreds of thousands of girls.
David, I think, we have plenty to talk about, but we also are a bit restrained by time. There's a closing ceremony coming along.
That's right.
For the US Champs, and then you're going to present in the next couple of days. Thank you very much for joining us. Anything else you would like to add? Any sort of pitch about any of your new experiments?
I'm not so big on self-promotion, but I'd say, because I don't know how often you're allowed to say this on your own podcast, but you guys are doing a real service to chess with this podcast. I listen to it every week on the bike. I've got it in the headphones. So yeah, keep it up.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks
for being on. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.